Hello. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Kyle, as well, for being here and giving this talk today. I would also like to thank the sponsor for this room, which is Q, an IT and digital talent firm in LA focused on finding local technology talent through deep involvement in the SoCal tech community. Please do not hesitate to contact them through their website or if you find them somewhere around here. Today's talk is by Kyle Rankin, Director of Engineering Operations at NCC Group Domain Services. He has been SCaLE for quite a few years now. He gave the keynote talk a couple of years back. Today he will be talking about Tails. With everything we know now about spying and hacking, from the hacker next to you in the coffee shop all the way to government surveillance, now's as good a time as any to learn how to protect our privacy and anonymity. The Tails project provides a live bootable disk that sets up a secure anonymous session on any computer with all traffic routed over Tor. In this talk, Kyle will discuss how to download and verify the latest Tails release and demonstrate some of the more advanced features of Tails, including its persistence encrypted storage. So let us all welcome Kyle, and do not forget to fill out the feedback survey for the presentation and the presenter at the end of the talk. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear in the back okay? Is this louder? Okay. How about if I move it down a little bit? Is this better? I mean, I can just talk loudly. I just didn't want to get too excited and everybody in the front dies. Okay, great. Because when we're talking about stuff like encryption and security, it's hard to not be excited. So here's what we're going to talk about today. So actually, really quickly, we should probably say why I'm doing this, because you see Director of Engineering Operations, that and I'm concerned about my privacy don't necessarily mesh. So by day, I do sysadmin type work. I work for NCC Group Domain Services. We're sort of a very high security focused startup, so I spend a lot of my time thinking about security. But what's driving this talk is actually outside of work. I do a lot of technical writing, so I have a column for Linux Journal that I've maintained for a number of years. And I've written a number of different books as well. And this is sort of spawned by two books I'm working on this year that are both security focused. So one's going to be on server security, which this isn't really about, but the other's going to be focused more on end user security and privacy. And so I've been thinking a lot about that recently, and that was sort of the driver behind this talk. All right, so what do we talk about today? First, it's good to introduce what Tails is. Why you would use that given all of the other live disks that are out there or other software out there. Like what would you use Tails for, the average person? What it can do for you. It's also really important to talk about what Tails can't do, because a lot of people, when they see some of the statements about what Tails does, they assume that it can do many things that it can't do. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit. I'm actually going to spend a fair amount of time on how to properly get Tails, because if you want to use it for what it's intended for, you don't want to mess up that step. It's very important to both get it properly and to validate it properly if you want to use it in a trusted way. Then after that, I'm going to break most convention and do demos. You typically do not want to do that in a talk, and we're going to see what happens with that. But the rest of it, I'm just going to sort of demonstrate what Tails looks like in case you've never used it before, demonstrate some of its features live. And then we'll take some questions. All right, so what is Tails? It's a live DVD and USB Linux distribution. There are millions of these things out there, both security focused and not. This one in particular is focused specifically on privacy and anonymity. It's not like, for example, there's Kali Linux and other distributions that are focused on security tools. This is not. This is focused on privacy and anonymity tools. So, for instance, all traffic when you use Tails is routed over Tor by default. It goes to great lengths to ensure that, I'm not going to get into all the details of what it does, but it goes to great lengths to ensure that all traffic is routed over Tor. So what is Tor? You could give a talk about Tor, but the very short message is Tor is a anonymity, like a privacy and anonymity focused network that allows you to not just use the internet in general while preserving your anonymity. It makes it very challenging for an attacker or an adversary to know, if you're using Tor, to know what sites you're visiting or where you're going on the internet, and vice versa, to associate where someone using Tor, what sites a Tor router is using, to associate that with you personally. It makes it very challenging to do that. I'm not going to get into the specifics here because, again, that's a talk all to itself. So, in addition to that, it includes a browser that has a lot of security plugins enabled by default. In fact, if you've ever used the Tor browser bundle, it's basically the same thing, intentionally so. And we'll talk about that later too. But yeah, so it comes with a browser with a lot of security plugins by default. It leaves no trace behind. It's very focused on not leaving state in any way behind. A lot of live disks will say, oh, I see you have a swap drive on, a hard drive on the system. Oh, and there's swap. I'm going to go ahead and use that swap just in case I need it, or things like that. Tails makes a big point to leave no trace behind, to the point that when you turn off Tails, when you reboot or shut down the system, it actively scrubs RAM before it shuts down. All right, so why would you want to use this? Again, there's many live CDs out there. Why would you personally want to use this? Here's a couple of use cases, not all of them, of course, but here's some. Just the most standard use case is you're a regular person who cares about privacy. There are a lot of things out there right now that are fighting against an average person using the internet with any level of privacy at all. Anything from just commercial entities that find your data very valuable to government entities that find your data very valuable. And so it's nice for the average person to have some way to do certain steps to use the internet with some degree of privacy. So that's just probably the most average use case. You may need to use someone else's computer securely. So maybe it's someone you have to, for some reason, check your email or you do something on someone else's computer that maybe you don't trust, or you don't have your laptop for some reason, but you need to use that hotel computer. You know, that one in the little business center that looks kind of shaky and shady, and you're not so sure about that. I mean, it's also kind of shady to just go ahead and reboot it into whatever you want, but just saying. But most of them, they totally let you do that. So, and there's some things that Tails allows you to do so that when you do that, no one will know that you're doing that. I won't demonstrate that, but I'll talk about it a little bit later. I'll talk about it now. Why not? So Tails, when you boot up, it has some options you can enable. One of them is Windows camouflage mode. And the idea behind this is, again, you're at a coffee shop or you're actually legitimately needing to use this on an anonymous computer. You can go to the hotel computer, turn on Windows camouflage mode, and it looks like a Vista desktop when it boots up, and all the icons have been changed and that sort of thing. So at a glance, it just looks like you're running Windows again. So a couple more serious use cases. You may live in a repressive regime where free speech isn't really allowed, and you need maybe there's some sort of abuses you would like to report or things like that. Again, this is a little more serious, but Tails would potentially allow you to speak out about abuses, that sort of thing, without identifying you personally. Of course, the downside even with Tor is that, and this is something that Tails doesn't do, it doesn't hide the fact that you're using Tor by default. So there are some regimes that find Tor to be such a threat that if they find out that you're using Tor, that in itself can implicate you. There are some ways around that. We're not going to really get into that here. It involves using a hidden Tor entry node. So that can be an option. There are certain ways, if you have to use Tor in a regime where you have to hide the fact that you're using Tor, there are some options. It may be that you need to handle sensitive information. Probably the highest profile examples of this are with the Snowden leaks. So Laura Poitras, Glenn Greenwald, Bob Woodward all used Tails when they were handling all the Snowden information, so they had some sort of secured environment where they didn't have to worry about this very sensitive information getting in the wrong hands. But it doesn't have to. Most of us don't have a USB key full of NSA leaks. Okay, sorry. So I don't want to. So raise your hand if you have a USB key with NSA leaks. Okay, just 1% in there. Okay. But that said, all of us potentially have some level of sensitive information already. So if you use Bitcoin at all, your Bitcoin wallet is fairly sensitive, and you don't want that to get in the wrong hands. So you might want to use Tails as some sort of secured environment when you need to do work with your Bitcoin wallet. Same thing with GPG keys. If you work with GPG keys, you may want some sort of offline machine that you use to generate a secure GPG key, things like that. Or just, again, any other kind of sensitive information. Excuse me. Okay, so maybe you have these use cases, but why specifically would you use Tails and not something else? Well, number one, you could use your own workstation, but actually properly securing a workstation is hard. Even if you kind of know what you're doing, it can be very challenging to definitely to go to some of the links that Tails goes to protect your anonymity and privacy and security. It's very difficult. There's a lot of things a lot of mistakes you can make, and just one mistake can identify you. If you go back to the story of Lulsec and Sabu, he just messed up. He had bad operational security once, and that was all it took to be identified. So it's very challenging to maintain this kind of a profile over a long period of time, and so anything that you can use that can help you along that way is useful. So you could do this with your own workstation, but again, it only takes one mistake. It's also hard to know, just if you're an average person, what security tools you should use and what you shouldn't, or what software is good to use and what not to use. For instance, Tails happens to install Pigeon because you might want to be able to use some sort of secured OTR chat. However, the vast majority of Pigeon support is through libpurple. That some people are concerned about the security record of. So to sidestep that, it's just removed. That's one example, but there's just a lot of other. You may not know what the proper tool to use is, and Tails makes it fairly simple by including things that a number of people agree are best tools to use. Also, sometimes if you're compromised, it's hard to know it. Again, I don't want to assume. So if you're compromised right now, if you just show of hands, if anybody, okay, good. Again, about 2 or 3%. So, yeah, everyone should have raised their hand. But again, maybe you don't know. So, again, it's hard to know, and so if you're doing sensitive things on a computer that you think might be compromised, it can be somewhat risky. So it's nice to at least have an option to use something like Tails where you are in a fairly secured environment already. All right. So what kind of stuff can Tails do? We talked about some of this a little bit already. So one, you can set up a secure environment easily to use Tor. These days, it's fairly simple with the Tor browser bundle to do that for web browsing. But in Tails' case, it does everything over Tor. So this is it makes it way easier to route all traffic over Tor. It definitely makes it easier to use a browser securely. There's a lot of security plugins that it adds and enables by default that we'll talk about a little bit later. That, again, you can do this on other machines, but this makes it easy because it's all set up for you. This in general to provide a lockdown secure environment on an untrusted computer or network. We talked about this with the hotel computers. Again, it can be challenging to do that. It makes it a lot easier. Also, ensure no data is left behind on a computer. A lot of other live disks or software don't really go to these kind of links to make sure that you don't leave a trace behind. Excuse me. And just in general, just to put a lot of good tools in one place, not too many. The whole point is to not have the less software on the system, the fewer attack vectors. So the idea is to keep it fairly slim. All right. So what Tails can't do? It can't protect you from a determined, well-funded adversary specifically targeting you, at least without extra security know-how. So if for some reason you have personally angered the People's Liberation Army, so show of hands, who has personally angered? Okay, so if they're specifically targeting you and they're well-funded, just saying, well, I use Tails won't necessarily by itself protect you. You have to have extra security know-how and go to extra links to do that. So it's not a silver bullet. It also can't necessarily save you from yourself. So it won't stop you from logging into Facebook and then buying drugs from Silk Road, which would then potentially associate the identity, right? So it's like, oh, I'm someone who is browsing all the traffic coming out of this Tor exit node, and I notice Bill logs into Facebook and posts a post and talks about where he had dinner, and then immediately after he goes to Silk Road and buys some crack. So yeah, so or we call that Saturday around here. So it won't stop you from doing that. All right. It also won't stop you from installing insecure software. So Tails has the ability, using the persistent disk, to install new software on the system live. It won't prevent you from installing something that's not secure. So if you, by default, it tries to make that difficult. It warns you and things like that, but it won't stop you from doing that. So if you say, you know what, I really need Skype because I want to do a video chat with somebody, it won't stop you from installing Skype if you really, really want to use Skype, but you don't. So don't do it. It also won't block your plain text emails. It doesn't magically make emails encrypted. All right. So if you send some sort of implicating email, something that's out using Tails, it doesn't automatically encrypt all emails going out or anything like that. So it won't protect you against that. It doesn't make password1 a good password. It can't do that. So if you have lousy passwords out on the internet, it won't somehow protect you from someone hacking your account just because you do it over Tails. You still have to have decent security practices. Oh, also, and this is pretty important, it leads into the next thing, Tails can't force you to validate that the Tails ISO you have hasn't been tampered with when you downloaded it. All right? I highly, strongly encourage you to do that or to get a copy of Tails from a trusted source, but it can't make you do that. And so one potential attack is for someone who is in between you and the Tails website giving you a copy of Tails that isn't legit. If that's true, then because of course, you are potentially a target because you are seeking something that protects your privacy. There were some leaks that came out, 2 years ago, a year and a half ago, about how Tails specifically, people who visited the Tails site, and also linuxjournal.com, but let's not talk about that. But people who visited the Tails site were flagged for extra surveillance because it was suspicious to go to Tails. So this is considered a suspicious thing, guys. So anyway, there's potential that someone may want to tamper with your download if you are so concerned about privacy you want to use this. All right, so how do we protect against that? The easiest way to get Tails is to install from an existing validated Tails install, like I have here. That said, everyone walking up with USB keys, I'm not just going to plug a random USB key into my computer that you hand me. That's just like bad hygiene. There's a lot of metaphors in life that you can make that applies to that, but basically don't just like plug in random USB keys in your computer. It's not safe. So I'm not going to do that for your average person here. But if you have someone that already has Tails, that's the very easiest way to get it. All right. The harder way is to download and validate the ISO yourself. So let's talk about that. So first, you can download the latest ISO from the official site. Now, it's an HTTPS site. Validate the certificate of this site. It should have a valid certificate. All right. That's step one. So make sure that you're going to the legitimate Tails site.
Lenovo computers always have valid certificates.
It's true. Yeah, so as an extra plus, if you do have a Lenovo computer, specifically one between like September and November of this past year, like a brand new one, then you don't have to worry about this stuff. It's taken care of for you.
On a serious note, though, others like Chrome try to maintain its own revocation list for some of this stuff. Don't rely on your browser or single piece of software. Go and verify it with the actual issuer and check the URL. Don't just rely on your application or
Right. Well, and again, this is just like step number one. If you're going to go to the site and for some reason you're getting a self-signed cert for Tails, then that raises, or an expired cert, that should raise an eyebrow. All right. So that's just step one. Once you download the ISO has a corresponding .sig file, and you want to download that as well. So back in the day when not really back in the day. Back in the day, we installed Linux from floppy disks, like you do. So shortly later than that, we installed Linux from ISO files, and you would always have that MD5 sum, right? And the whole thing is you download this 700 meg ISO, and then you would run MD5. You get an MD5 sum file to make sure that it wasn't corrupted in transit. This doesn't have an MD5 sum file. Why does it have a SIG file? So MD5 sum validates the file that you have matches the file the MD5 sum was generated for. It's basically to say this file probably wasn't corrupted in transit, and the file that you downloaded from this site should match and should be equivalent. But what it doesn't do is MD5 sums don't protect you against an attacker who could tamper with both the ISO and the MD5 sum in transit. If I'm an attacker and I want to give you a tainted version of Tails, well, he's downloading Tails now. Perfect. I'm going to give him this version of Tails. Oh, he's downloading the MD5 sum. Great. I'm going to give him this MD5 sum that totally matches my tampered version of Tails. That's not a hard thing to do, right? Generate an ISO, generate an MD5 sum. You download it, and I will send you the tampered version. Oh, it totally matches. We're good. So the SIG file is actually a GPG signature, not an MD5 sum. So, excuse me. So it both proves that the ISO is complete, so you're not getting something that's been damaged in transit, but it also helps prove that it came from Tails and not from somebody else. So it uses GPG to do this. So how does that work? So we have to validate the image. Like I said, a man-in-the-middle attack could even attempt to rewrite that SIG. They could generate their own signature file that appears to match the tainted ISO they're giving you. But you need to verify that the SIG itself is legitimate. So how do you do that? First, let's validate it. If the Tails author happens to be in your GPG web of trust, if you go to a lot of key signing parties and you just happen to be like, oh, he's just a hop away, then that's great. GPG, you can just use straight up GPG to validate the SIG. Your average person probably doesn't go to enough key signing parties for that to be true. So there's some less ideal alternatives that are still reasonably secure. So what I recommend you do is to download the SIG file from different computers that are on different networks, maybe even some that you don't control, if you're concerned about this. Then run a SHA-256 sum against all the SIG files and make sure they match. So what are we doing here? We're basically saying it's not necessarily all that difficult to man in the middle one connection, but it's pretty difficult to man in the middle like 20 of them or 7 of them that are on different networks and different locations from different computers. All right, it's not impossible. And again, ideally you would have a GPG web of trust. Barring that, this is at least a decent second step. All right. So download from multiple locations. Make sure they all match. If they all match, then you have a reasonable belief that the SIG file is legitimate. All right. Optionally, what you could do is Tails also has its signing key available that you can download, and you could import that into your GPG web of trust. So here's the command to do that, and you can see what the key looks like here. If you see a different value than what I have here in my slides, send me an email because it would be kind of interesting. So just a little note there. So now that you've done this, you can use GPG to verify the signature against the ISO. Here's how you do that. So perfect, it barely fits on the screen. So GPG, and here's the command. I'm not going to read this off, but essentially what you pass is the verify argument, then the path to the signature file, and then the path to the ISO. And that's the format to do that. What you should see is, so you see here, this is an example of what you will probably see because you probably don't have the signing key in your web of trust. You're going to see the signature is good. So this is legitimate output, good signature from Tails developer signing key. But you see a warning. This key is not certified with a trusted signature. So what this is saying is the signature matches, but we don't know, we can't necessarily trust the signature because you haven't gone to a key signing party with the Tails developers. So again, it's a warning. This doesn't mean that it's invalid. It means the signature matches. If you see this, don't freak out. It means the signature matches. It just means you're not in the web of trust. So again, not ideal, but it's a reasonable compromise. All right, so now we've done that, we need to install the image. If you have a DVD, we'll just burn the ISO to a DVD. All right? Remember DVDs? So USB is a little more involved. So first, you need to install SysLinux. It's pretty much available for every distribution, and if it's not, then you're running a lead enough distribution that you don't need me to tell you how to install it. So insert the USB drive and identify its device name. So you install a USB drive, you can run dmessage or something, and you can see what device it comes up as. If you have usually a modern desktop, it will want to helpfully auto-mount all that stuff because you're probably plugging in something with like a FAT32 drive or something on it. it's going to try to auto-mount that. I recommend just unmounting anything that's mounted automatically. So let's say that the drive turns up as SDC. We use a command called ISO hybrid to modify the ISO to a USB-ready image. This is kind of a weird command. I'd never actually messed with this too much before using Tails. This is what it looks like. So what I do is I don't want to modify the raw Tails ISO. I kind of want to keep that pristine. So I create a copy of it, and then I take that copy and I run this ISO hybrid command. And what this does is this modifies the image to be ready to be booted as a USB drive. Then you can use a handy-dandy all-purpose DD tool to image whatever your device is. So in my case, Dev SDC with the ISO, and it looks kind of like this. There's a couple different ways you can use DD. I like doing a byte size of 1 meg. You don't necessarily have to. That's just it's muscle memory, right? You just sort of type things a certain way. But here's what it looks like. All right. So interesting note, you run this, now you have a Tails install. You will be able to boot off of it. It will boot into Tails. When you try to set up a persistent image, it will complain that it's not valid. What it wants you to do is it wants you to create a persistent image from, essentially what you have to do like this weird bootstrap approach, where if you go this route and now you have a USB key, you need a second USB key. All right? So you boot up Tails, and Tails has some included tools within it that allow you to create new Tails disks from an existing Tails disk. You need to do that. Once you do that, the second USB key now, you can create persistent volumes and all that stuff. So it's a weird middle step, but if you want to use persistent volumes, which you may not need that, but if you want to, then that's the step you have to perform. It's a little weird. All right. Oh, great. So plenty of time for a demo. Let's try this out. All right, so welcome to Tails, everybody. So, you know, I've been running from Tails the whole time. So, crazy. All right, so here's what it looks like. Let me just minimize this for a second. Oh, wow, it looks like a regular desktop computer. There's not even anything lead on it. Like, it's not green on black, which would be preferable. But, you know, I mean, the theme's kind of a black theme, but that's just kind of like a good contrast. So, all right, so it's a little different. I mean, this looks fairly standard. This is actually based on Debian Wheezy now, so this is sort of like a fairly standard Debian Wheezy desktop with some tweaks. So among them, see this little onion here, this is the Tor network applet. So this lets you know you're connected to Tor. When you first boot up the machine and connect to a network, it'll sync your time, and then you'll see this onion start to change colors and attempt to connect to Tor. And we can click on this and see bandwidth graphs and see network maps that look like you're like an evil villain. It's like all this traffic's routing all over the world and stuff. In addition to that, there's this handy-dandy on-screen keyboard. This isn't simply an accessibility thing, although that's great. If you're using a computer that you suspect may have a keylogger installed, and you need to type in a sensitive password, you can use either fully the on-screen keyboard or a combination of the physical keyboard and the on-screen keyboard to type in that password. So this is just like a little extra handy-dandy thing here. Let's talk about the browser a little bit. So this is a standard Firefox browser. This is actually intentionally designed to be like the Tor browser bundle. The reason it is the idea is Tails does not want as much as possible for you to be identified as a Tails user. What they want is maybe that they want it to look like you're just using the Tor browser bundle like anybody else, because that way there's just a wider swath of signatures out there that everyone looks like they're just using the Tor browser bundle from something, maybe from Tails, maybe not. So this is the standard Tor browser bundle. So if you've ever used that before on a desktop, very similar, same plugin, same everything. So what kind of plugins? Well, number one, it's using Start Page by default. It's not using Google. Start Page, basically, you can think of it almost like a Google proxy, I suppose. So you send your Google query to Start Page, and then it will send it to Google on your behalf. And so this idea is this misdirection. In Start Page, like Pinky swears, it won't share your information. In addition, we have the great Tor-enabled button here. So Tor is on this desktop, or I'm sorry, on this browser. We have NoScript, which is set to stop all JavaScript, which means a lot of you very cutting-edge developers, none of your websites will work because you do everything in JavaScript, right? Because that's just the way that we do things. So if you do that, a lot of these websites won't work. If you've never used NoScript before, it can be kind of enlightening to browse the modern web with all JavaScript disabled by default. So what you can do is on certain sites that just don't work at all without JavaScript, you can enable on a per-site basis. What's very enlightening about using NoScript is that you see just how many ad network JavaScript every single site pretty much on the internet uses. So you can, like I'm browsing to bob.com. Okay, great. Yeah, I want to enable JavaScript from bob.com and bobimages.com. That makes sense. Oh, wait, there's adtrackingnetwork.com, and there's, like 70 different like JavaScript sites that are not anywhere related to bob.com that are also loading. So you can turn those off. So it's kind of a nice thing. In addition to that, let me go back. It doesn't really matter, I guess. In addition to that, it also uses HTTPS Anywhere. The idea about this is an extra browser plugin that by default, when you go to a website, usually you type in blah.com, or maybe you're a internet user that just types in a search query in your address bar. You don't even know what a website is anymore, really. You just kind of like type in some keywords and a little. But if you are somebody that's old school enough to know the actual domain name of the site you're visiting, when you type that in, by default, usually it will go to HTTP, right? So unencrypted. The HTTPS Anywhere plugin will default to HTTPS, and only if that doesn't load will it fall back to HTTP. So just extra plugins like that are pretty nice. What else is there? There's this pretty cool little there's all kinds of different tools to make it easy. I'm not going to get into like disk encryption too much, but there's tools that make it easy to plug in a USB drive and encrypt it just from Tails. Tails has its own. There's a talk about configuring persistent volume. I'm going to get to that in a minute. But the Tails installer here, that's a pretty nice little GUI tool that allows you to use this Tails install to clone onto another USB disk. It's pretty handy. A lot of just sort of standard tools. Like I said, there's Pigeon that just has IRC and Jabber enabled. And it also has OTR included by default. Is there a question? So the question is about, by default, Tails is not persistent. But because everything is in RAM, can you create something persistent? Yes. So that I'm going to talk about that once. I'm going to actually reboot this to do that. So I'm going to point out most of the desktop, then I'm going to demonstrate how the persistent desktop works. So it's definitely possible. One of the other nice features, so there's like a lot of GUI tool, well, KeePassX. If you're not using some sort of password manager, you really should. And KeePassX is a pretty nice one. I like using it personally. You remember one really good password, and then all the other passwords for every site are line noise that you can tell KeePassX to generate for you. It's pretty handy. All right, so there's this nice little OpenPGP encryption applet that Tails has that's pretty nice. So let me show you how you might use that. Let's go to a text editor. It's not GVim, but that's okay. We'll live through just using a regular gedit text editor. So I have a secret. All right. So I have a secret here. I'm not, let's say I'm not, I don't have this big OpenPGP web of trust. I haven't done all of the heavy lifting to set up a GPG key, but I would like to use Tails, encrypt the secret, and then email that secret to somebody else who can then decrypt it. All right. One way you can do that without keys is via a shared passphrase. So you have some sort of shared secret between the two of you. So what you do here is I select this. Now it's in the clipboard. And I can click on this and it says encrypt clipboard with passphrase. So whatever text is selected now in the clipboard can be encrypted. Type this in. I can type in a secret, passphrase, very weak one. Repeat it. All right. Now my clipboard has changed and it has something encrypted in it. So what I can do here, you can see it just turned into a lock. Maybe you can see that. There's a little lock up there now. You can click on it. You can see different things. This can also manage actual GPG keys, but let's just do an easy case here. Now if I let's say I had my email program open and I wanted to send this secret to somebody else, I can go to edit and just paste it. Right now, and here's my PGP message. All right, so now here's my PGP message. I send that to someone else who's maybe they're using Tails. All right, they open up this encrypted message, and they want to decrypt it, but they know the passphrase. So they can select this message. All right. So we can do decrypt or verify keyboard, clipboard. Actually, let me see if I can, yeah. Now I enter my passphrase. There you go. So it decrypts it for you. All right. So it's just like a very easy way to do encrypt secrets without having to worry about the web of trust. All right. So a lot of other things we could get into, but let's spend a little bit of time talking about persistence, because if you want to use this routinely, there might be certain settings you want to persist across. Maybe you're working on some documents. Maybe you want to use this for your Bitcoin wallet, and you want to have your Bitcoin wallet on an encrypted persistent disk. So Tails has this persistent volume feature that you can configure. Loads up a second. Forgive the speed of my awesome X60. Yeah, of course it's not unlocked. Oh, I can't demonstrate what the setting here because I have a persistent volume set up on this disk, so it doesn't want to create a new one because one already exists. So here's what I'm going to do. I will reboot into the persistent volume so you see what it's like, and then I can show you the settings. So what we'll do is we'll reboot. Reboot immediately. Oh, bummer, you're not seeing this. What it's going to do right now is it's saying, please remove the USB flash drive, press enter to continue. It reboots really fast, which is nice in case you're using this maybe in a hotel business lounge or something. When you hit enter, it's already scrubbed the RAM for me, and now it's going to restart the system. Again, you can't see a lot of this, which is kind of unfortunate. But I'm going to reboot the system. It will take a minute. But what I will demonstrate here once this gets up and running is at the login screen, there's a couple different options. There's not, by default, there's just one user called Amnesia, which is pretty apt. And there's a couple different settings you can set. I talked about the Windows camouflage mode already. You can also set a root password, which usually you don't want to. There's actually no root password by default. You cannot be root. If you just boot up Tails normally, there's no way to become root, which is a pretty good thing. Sometimes you may want to, particularly if you're setting up a persistent volume and you want to install packages. You'll need to be root to do that. So there's an option when you start up Tails before the desktop starts to set a temporary root password for just this session, and then it does that. Again, you can also set up the camouflage mode. You can also, by default, the MAC address of your interfaces are randomized with Tails, but you can turn that off if you want. It used to be the opposite. By default, in the past, it was something you could turn on. Now it's oh, that looks great. It'll be better in a second. I blame LibreBoot for that. But anyway, so what was I saying? Yeah, so you can set a password by default, and then you can do things as root. And it randomizes MAC addresses by default, although you can turn that off. You can also pick a different Tor entry node. Like I said, you might be using this on a network or on an area where using Tor itself is dangerous. And so if you're using, okay, great, you can see this now. All right, so a couple things you want to do is I want to say yes, more options. And yes, I want to use persistence. So when you set up a persistent disk, it prompts you for a passphrase. So you want to pick a pretty secure passphrase because this is an encrypted volume on the same USB drive. So let me type in my passphrase. And like you can see there, you can also set it to be read-only, which is nice. What that does is you can access the data, but you don't have to worry about maybe an attacker getting in and modifying that data. So if you want to, oh, I typed it in wrong. What is the long password? See if that's better. All right. So here's some of the other options. So I said show more options. So you can see activate Windows. Oh, it's Windows 8 camouflage now. So they've upgraded the theme. It's really nice. I'm not going to turn that on. I mean, I know it seems pretty awesome, but you can play with that at home. Again, you can set an administrative password here, which is useful if you want to install packages, do things as root. Again, spoof all MAC addresses, and this network configuration. This is where if you were concerned about the leaking that you're using Tor, you can change all kinds of different network settings here. We're just going to log in now. So a couple of things. Because normally there's no saved settings, you have to, remember your Wi-Fi settings. You have to, type in your Wi-Fi passphrase every time you use Tails. That's something that you can enable in persistent settings to remember. There's a couple of other look, now we have a super elite desktop background, which is very important if you're going to do super elite work. Again, it's taken a little while to load. This is an X60 32-bit system. So notice it's already connected to the network because it remembered the Wi-Fi passphrase here. And it's synchronizing the clock right now. While we're waiting, it's going to start connecting to the Tor network. And again, if I were to launch the browser right now before Tor was connected, it would warn me. It's like, Tor's not connected yet. You don't want to do that. So don't. You say, I know what I'm doing, and it'll let you do things. It also has a mode where you can use a browser outside of Tor. It's like in red, and it warns you, and lights flash and stuff. But you can do it. It does allow you to shoot yourself in the foot. There are some reasons why you may want to bypass Tor for a minute. All right, so you can see this turns yellow. Eventually, it'll turn green, but we are connected to Tor now. As you can see, this is nice and neat. I also did something which is very important, which is to change the default terminal profile to be green on black, which is, of course, more important than pretty much anything else. So that's set up. But let's talk about really briefly about what persistent settings are. Let's go here. There's a lot of different things you can persist. Now, the recommendation is to persist as little as you can get away with. Because all of these things are sort of nipping away at some of the protections that Tails has in place. By default, it may just be you want this first one, personal data. Keep files stored. There's a directory now in the desktop called persistent. Not actually in the desktop, in the root here. So there you go. I was actually using Tails as a platform to download LibreBoot and build all the dependencies within Tails and then flash the BIOS of this particular laptop with LibreBoot, all within Tails persistent. So now that I have that, I have this disk I can plug into X60 after X60 and reflash it. And that's a whole other talk too. So you can remember your GNU PG settings, your SSH settings. That's useful if you're going to SSH into a number of hosts. You can save that. Particularly useful if you're going to SSH into Tor hidden services. You can set up your SSH config there that makes it easy to forward to the SOCKS proxy and do all that stuff that you need to do to make that work. You can remember pigeon settings if you want to, email settings, your GNOME keyring. Network connections is a very useful one. Like I said, your Wi-Fi passwords and things. Browser bookmarks. Printers, remember those? So you can, once you get a printer working in Linux, you don't want to lose those settings. So it's that's actually a more important setting than I gave credit. Okay, and one that I used here were apt packages and apt lists. So this will cache all the packages. So why is this useful? Again, I used LibreBoot, and there's all kinds of different app dependencies that it needs to be installed. By ticking these off, when I install them, it doesn't, next time I boot Tails, it doesn't automatically install those packages. They're just cached locally. So I don't even need a network connection the next time I want to install them. They're cached. I just say apt-get install whatever. They're cached locally. It doesn't even have to go out to get the apt lists. It can just install the packages, again, without me having to talk on the network. And dot files. So you can basically create symlinks into a directory here, and it will put them in your home directory so you can persist desktop settings. That's how I got both my Elite green on black terminal and the super Elite desktop background, which is Saccharomyces, which is actually brewing yeast. Well, we've got to see this because this is just super sweet. This is a microscopic image of brewing yeast excreting, which is pretty nice. So you didn't know that? Well, now you did. So, all right, that's pretty much it for this. Let me field some questions. I will go ahead and start the browser up again, and yeah. So the question is, the fact that you need to use syslinux to install Tails, is that an attack vector? I suppose so, although most distributions nowadays sign their packages to prove that they're valid and untampered with. So for the most part, you should be able to validate that the syslinux that you get is the official syslinux. And it's also just flipping a couple. I imagine you could change the tool so that when you run ISO hybrid, it does some other really nasty stuff. But the fact that you're getting a signed package from your distribution, you shouldn't have to worry about that too much. Let me just load this. Get to the last slide just because there's a couple of different links that you might find useful. All right. Also, so I wrote about Tails pretty extensively in a 3-part series in Linux Journal as well. So if you're kind of interested, if you're interested in the same topic, you're in the talk, but you're like, well, I'm not going to remember everything this guy said. You can go to linuxjournal.com and just look for Tails. And there's a 3-part series of articles I wrote on this where I cover a lot of the same material. And of course, these slides are here. I don't know if I want to call on you, Bill. Go ahead. Very good question. So the question from the front is, will visiting this put you on an NSA watch list? It will not, that we know of. It won't put you on the old NSA watch list. Why? Because apparently all they were targeting were Linux Journal articles that start with the word Linux. As you might imagine, that's a lot of articles. But not this article, because these articles start with the word Tails. So you're safe. I'm sure they would never have updated that. So anyway, any other questions? Yeah, sitting in the front. Okay, so the question is about cloud-based password managers. I'm not going to speak specifically to LastPass. Me personally, my personal preference is to not have copies of sensitive things outside of my control. Yeah, I mean, I just would personally prefer, because you're also saying, well, I certainly hope that the encryption they're using is legit, and there's no keys being provided to anybody else. Just for last minute, there's a ticking time bomb Jack Bauer circumstance where they would need to decrypt that, right? So for me personally, I feel better using completely open source software that can be audited by people smarter than me, and I deal with there's a pain point with that, right? Which means that you have this password database that you have to sync around, and that kind of sucks. And there's all kinds of, I mean, this could devolve into, there's a 50-minute talk about password managers, right? So won't really devolve into that. But yeah, me personally, I just like having the data as close to me as possible. So yeah. I think, yeah, so the question was, does Tails support alternative networks instead of Tor? I believe it does support I2P. So, yeah.
About the idea of using a password manager. So you think that for doing that, regardless of which one you use, you already make that much more valuable to the hacker? Because once they break only one, they now have all of them.
Sure. So the question is, aren't you basically, by using a password manager, are you putting all your eggs in one basket? The attacker now just has to figure out your passphrase for your password manager, and then you're completely done. That is true. However, the alternative is what most people end up doing, which is to have pretty weak passwords everywhere, or the same password everywhere. So the alternative is pretty much what you're talking about, which is I have this one really good password that I can remember, because it's hard to remember really good passwords. I have this one that I think is good, and I just use it everywhere. Right, or I have 3 that I think are good, and I just alternate depending on what day of the week. With the password manager, the nice thing is you only have to you can remember one really good one, and then you use the password manager to generate like 20-character line noise passwords that are a mix of alphanumeric symbols and all this stuff. And if some websites freak out about that stuff, they're like, well, I can't handle symbols, and that's cool. You just go to KeyPass X and you say, turn off symbols, but regenerate it. Now it needs to be longer because I don't, So you can generate these nice long passwords. You don't have to even know them. You don't even have to see them with your eyes anymore. They just show up in your clipboard. Or they can even do this crazy autotype. Although, if you use autotype, be very careful because it likes to shift to the last window that had focus and just like, here's your login and password. So maybe don't have a lot of like IRC open when you do that. Just a pro tip. All right, so in the back, Allison. Okay, so the question is, you care about privacy but not necessarily anonymity. Could you use Tails for that? Yes, I think Tails could be a great platform for that. Some banks may freak out about you coming from Tor, but some may not. It really depends. You could also So for instance, you could boot up with Tails to have a secured environment. They have the option to boot a different browser, an insecure browser that doesn't go over Tor. That is an option. So you could tick that off, run that, and then you could connect to your bank with that. Honestly, I think a lot of banks probably would accept connections from some Tor nodes. It depends on the bank, of course. So in the corner there. So the question is, are there any protocols that don't go over Tor? UDP doesn't go over Tor. So you can do TCP over Tor.
On top of that question, how is, I kind of know the answer, but how is DNS handled? It's handled through Tor or
It is handled through Tor.
but that's UDP, right? So it's just kind of a capsulation, sends it to the exit node, and then comes back.
Yeah. There's I don't remember the details right now, but yeah, because it can't use UDP, there's one of the facts on the Tails site goes into detail about that. But yeah, basically even DNS requests, which are actually pretty much like super sensitive information that people don't think about. A lot of people are like, well, it's just easier, 8888. That's just easy to remember. So I just send all my. Why do you think that's free? Think about it. So it's like the most valuable. It's more valuable than your Google searches, I would argue. Like every single place you visit on the internet is pretty valuable data. So and it's pretty revealing data. So yeah, it forwards all that over Tor, but not over UDP. Yeah.
Is there any GUI options for proxy chains for an end user concerned about the blacklisting of the Tor exit nodes built into Tails?
Well, it has that Vidalia GUI tool
Okay.
that allows you to change a lot of the settings. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes, sir. So the question is, would it be easier to get it from the OpenPGP servers? You could, but that doesn't guarantee. But if I have already man in the middle you, and I see that you're doing a request to pull that key from pgpmit.edu, I could potentially send you something else that I want you to have. So it's the same sort of problem with the signature file, is that if you have someone that's man in the middle you, you can request whatever you want, and they can send you back what they want you to have. So you, yeah, but adding that to your actual web of trust by saying you trust that via that mechanism will make a lot of GPG key signing party people pretty upset with you because you're not truly validating that it's the proper key, right? You can fetch it without, so that's one of the examples I give is fetching it without trusting it. You can add it to your key ring without trusting it. That's totally, you're correct. Yeah, that's completely an option. So you can download it straight from the Tails site even, which I would argue is probably better. But again, it's not, the best approach is simply just to download all the signature files, from a number of different locations. It's the second best approach, right? The best would be, for all of us to be buddies with the Tails people and be in their keyring, or they be in. Now that said, this is addressed on the Tails site as well. There are a number of key Debian developers, because if you're using Tails, you're also kind of trusting Debian to not have backdoors and things in the software. So there's a number of Debian developers who have signed Tails' official key. So via key signing parties like we have here, it's possible that you might be in the web of trust with a Debian developer that then trusts. So you might be willing to then trust the key because it's only like 2 hops away or something. So, any other questions? Yes. Well, so the question is about using with OwnCloud. I'm not sure I understand the question though. Use what with it? You mean to make Tails? Oh, I see. So you're sort of asking, more, like after this is booted up, with your persistent volume, like tying it into some sort of cloud storage provider to get files from there. You can. It doesn't stop you from doing that. I would sort of advise against getting files from the outside too much. Well, even so, in a way, it's worse if you're concerned about anonymity. So, for instance, I have servers that I own that I SSH into and do work from. Now, when I use Tails, all that's going over Tor. Awesome. But if you're monitoring the output from a Tor exit node and you see an SSH connection to one of my personal servers, there's not very many people that can do that. And so it's a pretty good indication. And then you start seeing streams of traffic going over that channel. It's a pretty good indication that I'm the one using the Tor exit node. It goes back to Bill buying crack and going to Facebook. It's the same problem. You want to be very careful when you're using, if you care about anonymity, again, using this and then doing things that personally identify you, especially if you have like pseudonyms in a couple different environments that you intend to keep separate. The idea is you use a particular Tails session just for one of those identities. And then you have a separate Tails session, either bouncing it or potentially maybe telling Tor to get a new network. It does that every 15 minutes or so by default, but I think. But anyway, you want to keep your identities separate unless you intend to have them all be mashed together. Yeah.
The networking portion, is that all plugged into the GUIs for the settings, or is it something done like on the firewall level to redirect the traffic? How is the guarantee for?
So the question is about all the network guarantees, all the firewalling and stuff. That happens way before when it boots up. It's intentionally, there is no GUI to configure that, I don't believe, and it's on purpose. They don't want to make it easy once you're booting in the Tails to bypass that if something malicious. It's routing. I know that it's a combination of routing tables and some IP table stuff. So, yeah, he has a whole page about that too, where he goes. Right. Yeah, it should be for the most part set. Like I tested that recently. I was like, that's true, but what about SSH? And so I SSH into a machine, logged out, and SSH back in. It's like last login from blah 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 Tor node or whatever. So, yeah, there's a question in the yeah. So the question was, what particular encryption algorithm does it use for persistence? I don't know that off the top of my head. I don't believe that you can change that without like getting into the source and things like that. By default, it does have the option to set up encrypted volumes that outside of the persistent volume. Now it's going to blink on me here. Sorry about that. It does have the option to set up just to plug in drives and encrypt them. There's like a GUI tool that allows you to partition drives and encrypt them. And then you can select different encryption options if that's what you'd like to do. So that's what I would recommend for that, is maybe have the persistent volume maybe not have the persistent volume, but format. If you don't want the features, like saving my dot files and all that stuff, but you just want to have a persistent volume for the store stuff, and you don't like the encryption algorithm, you can set up a different one, and it has the ability to mount it. Yeah.
How does it actually, when you run it for the first time?
Run which thing?
Well, how does it pick the entry node, the store entry node? Is it at the beginning, is it randomized?
Yeah, so the question is basically the first time you boot this, how does it know where to go for Tor? So it has a list of Tor. There's a set of Tor nodes that are sort of index nodes that have a knowledge of the available Tor nodes that you can connect to, and so it contacts one of those and gets a list. So Tor software is just configured to do that. Yeah. Yeah, like when you first boot up, even again, like if you're in a situation where you don't want, it's risky for people to know you're using Tor, you have the option to use like a hidden Tor entry node. Yeah.
It's more of a comment than a question. If you have MAC locking enabled on the switches and routers, your connections just don't allow it to start it off with a random MAC address.
Okay, so the comment was if you randomize your MAC address, I mean that would be true if I just plug this into a new network though too, right? Like if I connect to a network that has that and it only allows known MACs to traverse, but then that also again, defeats some of the anonymity. So yeah, it's true. If you block MACs that you're not aware of on your network, a randomized MAC generator will get you blocked. Yeah, in the very back. So the question that, which I love because it includes Alice and Bob, which is great for any security talk, is if I want to send an encrypted message to Alice and I want to send a separate encrypted message to Bob, do I have the flexibility with the clipboard tool to pick different passphrases? The answer is yes. Every time you select something new and tell it to encrypt with a passphrase, it can do that. Even better would be if you have their GPG keys. You can then pick the recipient and encrypt it just for that recipient. So yeah. Okay, so we're at an hour here, so I'm going to be outside. We can talk shop the whole time, but thank you very much for coming to my talk.